Hello everyone, I am Chucky Prophet, and welcome to what may well be the last in my ongoing retrospective of the games of the Devil May Cry franchise. It has been a long road to get here, and this is effectively the grand conclusion of everything the series has been about for the past 20 years, going all the way back to the inception of DMC1. I also feel that this is probably the game that is generally considered to be the best in the series by the community. It is extremely well regarded, in many circles a lot more than 3, the other most popular game in the franchise, and it has a lot to recommend it. A strong plot and an excellent revolution on DMC4's already pretty good combat to make something genuinely spectacular. But there are a few criticisms I have in key areas, so let's see if it lives up to all that hype, shall we? But before getting into it properly, I'd like to just give a little bit of a disclaimer. Now, I am by no means a pro at any of these games. I do not consider myself to be perfect at them. The only thing I can say for myself is that I've put a hell of a lot of time into them. Around about 150 hours into DMC5, and I've almost platinumed it, and the only thing that killed my platinum run was the immense grind towards the end. So yeah, I don't really consider myself a master of these games by any stretch of the imagination, and because it is such a mechanically intensive series, I do expect that there will be some things that I miss a lot of the time. So feel free absolutely to correct me on some of these finer points in the comments. That said, there is an argument for the fact that there are certain design decisions within this game and within the other games in the series that are just kind of bad design decisions, which can be circumvented if you've got the playtime and the experience needed to do so, like for example how generally awful the Blitz enemy is in DMC4. Exploiting the fundamental design and functions of the game in certain ways does not then make criticisms of that game moot. And I think generally the best perspective to come to any of these reviews from is as if I am a new player going into it with maybe 1 or 2 playthroughs under my belt, but also leveraging the knowledge that I have as someone who's put over 150 hours into it. So that's going to be the perspective that I come from. Anyway, I've yapped long enough, let's get going. Set years after the events of Devil May Cry 4, DMC5 follows 3 principal protagonists, Nero, Dante, and V. The game begins with a massive demonic invasion into Redgrave City, as a demonic tree bursts out of the ground and begins draining human blood. This is revealed to be the work of Urizen, a demon who is attempting to become king of the underworld, the same way Mundus did. It is also revealed that this is the demon who has severed Nero's demonic arm, taking the Yamato from it and using it as a source of his power. Wow, I wonder who this demon could be, huh? Anyways, Nero, Dante, and V are all defeated in the beginning of the game by Urizen, and Nero and V are only narrowly able to escape. 1 month later, they return to the city with the help of the best character, Nico the Mechanic. Nico provides Nero with a brand new arm, this mechanical prosthetic that can be switched out with various interchangeable models that allow him to use different unique skills, and it's one of his most fun mechanics in game. But we'll get to that, don't worry. We then switch a lot between Nero and V as they go around taking out bosses which act as Qlipoth roots, draining the human population of their blood in order to fuel the creation of the Qlipoth fruit, which Urizen wants to munch on in order to gain his ascendancy to Demon Emperor. Nero and V then split up. Nero goes up the tower, gets his ass handed to him by Urizen once again, and is saved by a mysterious demon. Oh boy, I wonder who this could be. We then cut back to V searching for the Demon Sword Spada, and while he looks for it, he comes across Dante's unconscious body. V rescues Dante, waking him up and giving him back the Sword Spada as the rebellion was broken in the fight with Urizen. Dante then wanders around for a bit, returning to his ancestral home and stabbing himself with the rebellion. And using the rebellion, Dante is able to fuse the Demon Sword Spada into himself, creating the Devil Sword Dante, a physical manifestation of his will. This also unlocks a new Devil Trigger form, the Sin Devil Trigger, which he uses to defeat Urizen in battle. Urizen then runs all the way down to the bottom of the tree to get the fruit. So then, our three protagonists join together and all make their own way down to the bottom. Dante is the first to reach Urizen and defeats him in a very climactic battle. After being defeated, V then reveals that he was in fact the whole time the human half of Vergil, who used the Yamato to split off his human and devil sides, because he believed that his human side was making him weak. V then recombines with the dying demon half Urizen and becomes full Vergil again. With full Vergil back in play, Dante then must reclimb the tower to go fight Vergil again. God, I'm getting DMC3 flashbacks. And at the top they have a big battle, as is their usual way. Now, Nero is put in an interesting position here, as he finally learns that he is the son of Vergil, the man who cut off his own arm and is currently trying to murder his uncle. This puts him in a bit of a weird position, and they resolve this in a very interesting way. Nero goes and calls Kyrie for advice, who manages to have more personality in this single 3-minute long phone call than she did in the entire 4-hour long DMC4 campaign, and then unlocks his true will. He wants to protect everyone around him, including Vergil and Dante, to make sure that they don't kill each other over their stupid rivalry, instead of doing what they should be doing, which is protecting the human world. So he climbs all the way back up to the top of the tower, beats the shit out of both Dante and then later Vergil, and convinces them to sever the Qlipoth for good. In order to do this, they need to jump into hell. So, a la DMC2, they do. And that's where the game ends, with Dante and Vergil trapped in hell, and Nero taking on the mantle of the Devil May Cry organization, of the Devil May Cry hunting agency. This plot is essentially meant to act as the grand conclusion to the decade-spanning Dante and Vergil rivalry, the final culmination of everything this series has been about for the last 20 years. So does it work like that? Well, yes and no. The story has a very interesting non-linear presentation to it. We jump around a lot between different characters in different missions doing different things, constantly being teased with something and then going back in time to figure out why it is that way. The best example of this being what I mentioned earlier with Dante showing up in his Sin Devil Trigger form and we don't know who he is, and then we kind of cut back and go and figure out who Sin Devil Trigger Dante is. This does a really good job of creating a constant sense of semi-mystery. Devil May Cry is not really at this stage going to take some grand out there leap, so we generally know all of the answers to the questions the game poses, but it's still a fun sense of mystery. You may know the answer, but you want to know why the answer is that way. You may be able to guess pretty easily that V has some sort of strong connection to Vergil, and also that Urizen has some sort of strong connection to Vergil. And you may even be able to pick up on the fact that Vergil is those two. But why? That's the interesting question, and that's what Devil May Cry 5 plays with quite well. The resolutions to these answers are all pretty interesting and play off of the series' themes, particularly what I mentioned before with Vergil's transformation. Believing himself to be too weak to continue in his present hybrid state, he splits off his human form, viewing it as like this weak cancer that he must rid himself of, and then the human form takes on its own personality and its own desire to return to being Vergil. The other reason why this plot structure is all jumbled and unconventional is because it enables this game to try and get away with how sudden this conclusion might feel to players. If you imagine it like this, right? If you go in chronological order, we have DMC3, which is a very, very plot important game, right? DMC3 is the beginning of the series. That's where Dante gains his Devil Trigger, that's where the beginning of the rivalry with Vergil starts, and that's where Mundus is introduced. Then we have DMC1. DMC1 is the giant climactic battle with the big bad, the literal Antichrist who has taken Vergil and corrupted him against his will into this demonic soldier with no soul or logic to itself. Following on from that, DMC2 is a side mission, sort of. The plot importance of Argasax is clear, but also not clear. It's made out that he's a threat on the same level as Mundus, but obviously because it's DMC2, it's very difficult to kind of scale the priority of everything. It is a real shame that the series has never really played off of any of the elements that DMC2 introduced. I get why, given how unpopular it was and how unlikely people are to play it, but it does feel kind of bad having this giant black spot in the middle of the series where nothing that happened in this game really matters. I wish they'd bring it in somewhere. And moving on from DMC2, you have DMC4, which is structured to feel very much like a side mission for Dante. It's Nero's story, but as I mentioned in my review of that, it doesn't feel like it is because of the jumbled up focus and lack of full attention to the game's plot. So it only really half works as a game by itself, and it definitely does not work as potential build-up to the culmination of everything this series has been about. So, having this unconventional plot structure and having this mystery allows us to bypass somewhat this feeling of anticlimax. This feeling the audience might have of just, well, I guess that's happening, because the mystery elements keep this constant sense of shock and intrigue that both distracts the player from that and augments the game's storytelling enough to where it can stand on its own as a grand conclusion to some degree. Additionally, the choices on how the wrap-up of Dante and Vergil's rivalry should actually be handled are perfect. The game doesn't go, yes, these two are best friends now. The game goes, yeah, they are still brothers and they're still gonna kick the shit out of each other, but at least this time, there is no genuine hatred there. Linked on with this, I originally really hated the Nero epically beats up Dante and Vergil in order to become the biggest and strongest, most powerfulest demon ever aspect of this plotline. But I realized I was kinda stupid. See, I played this game originally before Special Edition was even out yet, and at that time I didn't really understand the series or anything it was doing, and I generally just don't think I had the best media literacy skills because it's kind of very obvious that this isn't like a death battle, this person scales harder than this person, definite Nero would beat Vergil or Dante randomly out of nowhere thing. The entire point of this conclusion is that Dante and Vergil have tired themselves out fighting each other. Their constant battle as two people who are completely evenly matched only just leads to destruction around them, as the Qliphothr keeps eating away at reality and neither of them care enough to do anything about it. Nero then proves this point by dunking on each of them individually, and then saying, why aren't you going to go solve the giant tree that's poking a hole in the sky? It's meant to be a character-focused and theme-focused resolution, rather than just slapping action figures together. And I actually really like that it's handled in this way. Now, I'll get into greater analysis on this later in my Designs of DMC5 video, but Devil May Cry 5 fundamentally is a game about letting go of the past. Each of the characters has some sort of past injustice or something in their past that they need to let go of and move around. Nero regrets all the times that he was too weak to save those around him. Dante can't let go of the rivalry with his brother. Vergil can't let go of both the rivalry with his brother and the trauma from the time period where he was enslaved by Mundus, which he blames the weakness of his human side for. Even side characters like Nico have interesting little things to do with this theme, like Nico's dad is Agnes. So you would expect her to have some sort of hatred towards the man that killed her father, and Nico rationalizes it very well, clearly showing regret over the death of her father, but also acknowledging that he was a complete scumbag, very much in the same way that Lady did in DMC3, and don't worry, I'm gonna get to Lady. One of my main criticisms of this game, actually, is that it does not use all of the elements of DMC to their maximum potential. That's where I think a build-up game, or perhaps even just making this game a little bit longer, would have served the overall Devil May Cry story better, because characters like Lady would actually get to do something. But again, we'll get there. Honestly, outside of that though, I don't have that much to criticize about this plot. It adds that little bit of extra spice into it that DMC3 had, that makes the game fun to follow, unlike DMC4 or DMC1, where you can very much just kind of glaze over and not really mind anything that's happening. Where characterization is concerned, each one somehow relates back to the fundamental theme of this game of having the strength to let go. Nero finally grows into his own in this game as an interesting, fun character that isn't just Dante version 2.0. He gets a completely separate personality that doesn't feel like it's constantly trying to imitate what Dante does at every turn, and yet meaningfully iterates on what DMC3 Dante's character was like. They really nailed his personality as a much more aggressive and punky DMC3 Dante, but with a much better emotional outlet than his DMC4 incarnation. He's definitely visibly matured since then. Nero's growth into understanding and using his power in order to protect others feels very natural, and his final decision to save Vergil from himself rather than holding a grudge over the loss of his arm is really interesting and a really fun direction to take the character. Intentionally, despite being the most outwardly immature member of the cast, Nero is the one who finally takes the decision to look at Vergil and Dante's fighting and think, these two are being massive immature idiots right now. They need to focus on the bigger problem. And it's a surprising show of maturity from someone that you wouldn't expect that makes him a really compelling character. Plus, having a strong character to bounce off of like Nico makes Nero feel so much more fun and lively. It feels like they really nailed his sense of humor, being somewhere near Dante, but much more actively aggressive rather than boastful. V, meanwhile, is a fucking fantastic character. Unfortunately, most of it is locked behind the DMC5 side manga Visions of V, which is fantastic and you should definitely give it a read. Basically, it explains V's origins, what happens on the night where Vergil split his halves, and how V got to the point of asking for Dante's help. And that gives the necessary context that the game doesn't give in order to understand V's character in full. His desire to become one with his demon half and be Vergil again. The fact that you can see V as a part of Vergil, realizing how important his humanity was to his identity, and what he's lost now that he's ripped it away, which is a great introspective look into the character of Vergil. But on top of that, V's whole thing of like taking the trauma from when Vergil was Nilo Angelo in DMC1 and transforming it into the forms of DMC1 demons that are bound to V by tattoos is fucking amazing. It's such a cool idea, where you have Vergil's trauma becoming the power that he uses to retake his form. I think that's really, really fun, and an excellent, if a little on the nose, examination of the whole idea of facing the demons of your past. However, the main problem with V is just that he is underutilized. The character arc that he undergoes is amazing, but none of it is truly shown in the game. He speaks of a lot of it. He says a lot of these things are happening, but I don't really think you get to feel it in the same way you do in the DMC5 side manga. Additionally, while I do really like him being just sort of a dumb, edgy loser who quotes Byron at things, I can see why that might be a little bit of a Marmite thing for some people, where his character might come off as very irritating. I can definitely understand that. Dante is arguably the character that gets the least work done thematically. I think we've really reached a point in these games where Dante has kind of gone through his major development. As I mentioned earlier, DMC3 and DMC1 are the points where Dante, does the most as a character and reaches his endpoint. Past that, DMC2 obviously does nothing with him. DMC4 just kind of treats him as a side hanger-on. DMC5 does a little bit better. They do evolve on his character a little with his relationship with Vergil and how he sees Vergil, but he is just there because he's Dante. It feels kind of bad that of all of the main characters, Dante has the least role in anything. It would be much nicer if there was much more of a tangible sense of him having some sort of arc with Nero, given that Nero is the one that is supposed to take up his torch of protecting the human world at the end of the game. But while there is this kind of him learning to trust Nero arc in the background, it doesn't really get all that much focus, and so when it is resolved, it just feels a little bit that's there. But then again, he is the wacky, funny Waha pizza man, and he's still enjoyable in this game, even if I like his character less. Lady and Trish in this game are, sadly, relegated to the position of DMC-shaped scene dressing. They might as well not even be in the game at all. I think they have like 10 lines, maybe, between them. Now, this is sort of okay with Trish. Trish has not truly been a character anywhere other than the original DMC anime from 2007, and possibly some of the side mangas and books that I haven't read. Other than that, if we're just talking about explicit in-game appearances, she's kinda just a cool lady, and that's all. There's nothing really to her character, especially since all of her character development happens in DMC1, and really isn't the best handled there, which is a damn shame. Lady, however, well, she'd be fantastic for this game. Why isn't she more explicitly written into it? Her entire arc is about moving on from her past with Arkham, but she can't fully move on because despite how much she claims to hate Arkham, and she definitely truly does, she can't move on from the fact that that's still her father, and she still had to kill her father in quite a fucking brutal way too. And that fundamental inability to move on from the past, while, at the same time not regretting it, would be such an interesting way to bounce off of Nero and maybe even Nico, and especially for her to maybe give some advice to both Nero and DMC5 Dante to build on their decision to forgive Vergil at the end of the game. But instead, both her and Trish are just kind of relegated to occasional exposition. Sometimes they maybe mention something or say a decently cool line. Lady does mention Arkham, but it doesn't really do anything. It's just such a shame. These characters could do so much more if the game would just give them more space. I feel like this is almost a direct answer to how relatively unpopular they were as characters in DMC4, and now just completely abandoning them by the wayside. Now, it would be fair to say to me, Chucky, what the hell are you saying? This is supposed to only be like a 5 or 6 hour campaign, tops. How can you expect the game to balance all of these characters in a more effective manner? And you're right, I think it could have been longer. I'll say it. I think this game's campaign with the strength of the combat system itself, could have definitely stood to be a little bit longer, just to give us like a proper send-off to the series in terms of everything it possibly could have done. Now, obviously there are development deadlines and parts to the actual making of the game that I am not privy to, and certain parts will of course get cut out. I can only deliver criticism on the areas of the game that I feel let me down as a person who enjoyed it. But it doesn't mean that there aren't mitigating factors that I understand as to why those pieces of criticism couldn't have been acted on. Anyway, getting back to the original point, Nico. Nico is a really fun character. As I mentioned before, she mainly acts as someone for Nero to bounce off of. Both thematically, he learns a lot from her, and in terms of just having a fun presence for Nero to constantly bounce off of. So you have the not super serious, but a lot more serious Nero bouncing off the whimsical ass Nico, and it just makes a really fun dynamic. I love these two. A constantly fun presence and character, and a great way to introduce someone new to the series while actually adding something meaningful. From this point, there are a couple more side characters, but I don't really have time to go through all of them. But I will say that generally the story is able to handle most, looking at you Lady and Trish, of these new and recurring characters well, and give them a proper send-off. I think the biggest problem with character writing is that they didn't bring Lucia back. Nah, I'm just kidding. It is, however, definitely rushed, at least in terms of build-up to where it feels the conclusion should be. The resolutions that characters reach in DMC3 felt very naturally built up to as the result of these four characters bouncing off each other, taking things from each other or not taking things from each other, and becoming different as a result. Each one changes by the end of the game. Meanwhile, DMC5, because of its sporadic plot structure, it can't really focus on these characters enough, I think, to really give them that extra push and tighten up these arcs in a way that makes them feel satisfying. This may just be a me thing, though. It's just, I can see so much potential within this story for such a fantastic finisher to the series, but it just wasn't given that extra push, and that makes me a little bit sad. Also, the fact that I have to read an entire 50-page side manga if I want to get the cool bits of V's story. But overall, it's a very strong set of characters with compelling narratives and themes. It may not be perfect and it may not be DMC3, but it is really solid, despite me having some small problems with pacing and overall execution.
Now, before I begin talking about the gameplay of each of the characters, I'd like to start by talking about something that I haven't really gone into depth on before. Something which I think is blaringly obvious and that I should have clarified earlier into my retrospective of the series. What is style, anyway? Or at least, how does Devil May Cry categorize style? It's a very nebulous term that, like, you'll hear a DMC fan throw around, but what does it actually mean? What are the components of style? What does the game expect from you? Well, from my perspective, I can see three main components that the game wants you to really learn in order to be stylish. First, there's timing. Timing takes multiple forms. Timing can either be the timing of your inputs to make sure that you get different varied combo outputs, like was really important in DMC3. It can also be timing your attacks in between enemies' attacks, or when they're in their specific weak state, like enemies like Sin Scythes, for example, are supposed to teach you. It can also be timing of when to use your resources and resource management. For example, Devil Trigger, when's the right moment to DT during a boss? When's the right moment, for example, to unleash Nero's charge shot in order to get a stun? Timing is the most important integral core mechanic I feel to style. If you can't expertly time everything, well then you're just going to end up getting hit and not getting any hits in yourself. And it's also the ability that allows people to do crazy shit like juggling enemies for 30 minutes straight. The next element that I would identify is positioning. Positioning is a little bit less important, but it is still vital. Making sure that you're in the right spot in relation to the enemy to ensure that you're able to keep that combo going. Making sure that you're out of the way of any of the other enemies in the arena. Essentially positioning yourself so that you're not in danger while you're trying to do your combo. And then positioning in relation to the enemy while you're doing the combo. How you can continue that combo just by being in the right place at the right time. The final linchpin of style, moving on from that, is variety. If you just keep using the same weapon and the same set of inputs all the time, then it's not very stylish, is it? You're not getting your whole range of weapons in. So knowing how to use the entire breadth of your arsenal and the wide ocean of stuff that can be used specifically within DMC5 really plays into this. Every single character has shed loads of mechanics. Overall, more mechanically complex than DMC4, even though I think DMC4 Dante was a little bit more complex mechanically than his DMC5 counterpart. Overall, the game is a hell of a lot more mechanically strenuous in DMC5 if you want to learn it really, really well. However, this may seem daunting to someone who's not really been into the series. Well, handily enough, DMC5 teaches you each of these three main aspects through one of the main characters. First, we meet Nero. Nero begins the game originally as a very, very simple beat-'em character. He has low range, but high speed and high power attacks. And he requires that you innately kind of mix up your timings and inputs to get a decent style rank on him when you first play him. Nero's main focus as a character is on teaching the player timing. He exemplifies the easy-to-learn, hard-to-master mechanical portion of the game's combat. His Red Queen is his only main weapon to worry about, but in order to get good at using the Red Queen, you have to figure out all of its combos, and make sure you're using a variety of inputs to keep style rank high. Additionally, his Red Queen includes the use of the Exceed gauge. Basically, the Exceed gauge is what happens when Nero revs his sword to get an extra powerful attack. There's two main ways you can do this. You can rev your sword slowly outside of combat, or you can press the left trigger just at the right timing while you're in combat to instantly activate one or more levels of Gorge, using the Max Act system. This means, essentially, after every strike you pull off, you have to perfectly time a hit on left trigger in order to get a more powerful enhanced strike afterwards. The best Nero players can chain shitloads of max acts together and output absolutely loads of damage, whereas someone who's relatively inexperienced on Nero won't be able to get that max act, and as such, his damage is capped off a lot more. This is just one of the ways in which he tries to teach you timing. However, this is also how it worked in DMC4, where Nero attempted to teach similar skills to the player. And there I criticized it for feeling extremely button mashy in one note. It felt like the entire time I was playing Nero, I was just mashing, hoping for that Exceed, and he felt very disappointing without it. So is Nero better in this game? Yes and no. He does have quite a few mechanics that get introduced naturally throughout the course of the game, which broaden his gameplay and expand his skill ceiling by a significant amount, keeping his gameplay from feeling stale. However, I would still say Exceed is a little too vital for his kit. It does make it so that if you're someone like me who can't always manage Exceed timings, especially on higher difficulties, his damage starts to feel incredibly lackluster. Most of the time, if you're fighting on Dante Must Die, it feels like you're hitting your opponents with a wet noodle, unless you manage to land that Exceed, which I agree does make it feel a lot more satisfying when you land an Exceed, but it just makes Nero feel unsatisfying. That said, a lot of his other mechanics really make up for this issue and make him feel a more complete character than he was in DMC4, as his supporting mechanics are all also timing focused. His blue rose has a charged shot, which does good damage and knockback at level 3, even being able to stun some bosses, so you always want to have it charging ready to use it. However, knowing when to release it is exactly the kind of timing and resource management that Nero is supposed to teach. His Wire Snatch is a much improved version of his Devil Bringer, now requiring a little bit more precise timing to grab most enemy types, and generally feeling a lot weightier and smoother than it was in DMC4. And finally, there's the coup de grace, his new mechanical arm, the Devil Breaker. Devil Breakers, essentially, are interchangeable prosthetics, which each have their own special power. You have Overture, which generates a giant electrical hand which pushes most light enemies back and can stun them and knock them into the air. You have Gerbero, which allows you to fire this pulse of energy which can either knock enemies back or, with the right directional input, launch Nero into the air, allowing you to gain a whole new dimension to Nero's combat. There's then Punchline, which shoots out a rocket fist, which flies around enemies pummeling, and then if you recall the fist with the right timing, you can jump on top of it and fly around, slashing enemies as you go. Helter Skelter is a little underwhelming without its charge form, we'll get onto that, but basically it just kind of drills into an enemy and does a fair amount of damage. Then there's Tomboy, which powers up both your Red Queen and Blue Rose, making you lose control of Red Queen entirely, making its combos constantly exceeded and extremely powerful. Meanwhile, Blue Rose becomes a slow-moving turret that fires like railgun shots, which pierce through multiple enemies and get you shitloads of style rank. The Buster Arm functions essentially the same way as Nero's Devil Buster does in DMC4, except it's a little slower and a little bit more temperamental. Rawhide shoots out a metal whip that flies around, stunning enemies and can parry them really easily. And finally, my personal favorite, Ragtime, which generates an area of slowed down time, which Nero can manipulate to both stop enemy attacks in their tracks and juggle enemies once they're stunned because of the slowed time. All of these effects are fantastic and varied, and even though I feel that some Devil Breakers are underwhelming in their base form like Helter Skelter, it's all made up for with their additional mechanics. See, the fundamental interesting part of Devil Breakers is that unlike most other parts of a DMC character's arsenal, Devil Breakers are inherently meant to be interchangeable. They're meant to be lost and switched between as combat demands. That's why Nero has an arsenal of 8 on him at all times, which can be equipped at the beginning of the mission, allowing you to plan out what you want to use for specific encounters and how you want to use your Devil Breakers. The Devil Breakers then double down on this aspect of timing as well. You see, if you use a Devil Breaker power and then an enemy hits you, the Devil Breaker will break immediately on impact, forcing you to switch to your next Devil Breaker and losing what you might have gained from that one if you liked it and needed it for the situation. It places extra emphasis on Nero not getting hit as much as possible in return for having this constantly evolving skill set. Devil Breakers can also be switched between at any time. Nero can rip one off and put the next one on by pressing left bumper at any time that he chooses, allowing you to switch mechanically on the fly, but this will cause you to lose the Devil Breaker that you're using, so you have to use it with care. But the most interesting mechanic about the Devil Breakers comes in with their charge function. You see, each Devil Breaker has a completely different move that acts like it's almost like a super in a fighting game, where if you charge up for long enough, the Devil Breaker will glow with lightning and then use a new ability, some of which change based on whether or not you're in the air. Overture transforms from a giant lightning hand and instead places a sticky bomb on your opponent, which you can then shoot in order to do massive damage and with your charged shot in order to get like a big explosion and stun. Gerbera has a giant fucking laser beam which erupts out of it when you're on the ground. And in the air, because it's so based on aerial combat, you fire like these splinters of light which ricochet around the room, catching and stunning enemies. Punchline transforms into a giant fist and uppercuts the enemy into the air, ready for you to either join them there or catch them on your way down. Helter Skelter is built around its charge function, transforming Nero into a fucking drill that pierces through multiple enemies and knocks them into the air. Tomboy doesn't gain much out of its charge function. It literally just makes it so when you get hit while you're in your enhanced mode, you don't immediately lose the benefits on it, and it's switched onto a timer, which I guess is fine, but I would have preferred something a little bit more interesting out of it. Buster Arm also gets a similar thing. Rawhide does this really cool thing where Nero spins it around his head, and he picks up any enemies that he could pick up with his Devil Bringer, and just slams them into the ground repeatedly. And finally, Ragtime transforms its usually very contained time bubble and has it envelop the entire arena, preventing enemies from moving properly for at least 2 to 3 seconds, which can be vital in either catching enemies off guard or starting up really strong combos. However, once again, if you're at any point during this charge windup, you will lose the Devil Breaker, and you'll effectively lose it for nothing since you couldn't even get the charged ability off. This, once again, doubles down on Nero's whole mechanic of timing. Everything with Nero has to be executed to a pretty decent level of, fundamental mechanical skill if you want to get anything good off with him. However, my problem with the Devil Breakers is that they do suffer from a lot of balancing issues on higher difficulties. Some of them just don't really feel useful. In particular, the Buster Arm and Tomboy really fall behind in terms of utility towards Dante Must Die and Son of Sparta. They just don't feel like they offer that much compared to the others, and even ones that I really like Rawhide and Overture, they fundamentally aren't balanced for higher difficulties, so it feels like Nero can often be very railroaded into either using Gerbera or Ragtime to give him the extra ability to dodge in the air or to slow enemies as they attack. That's the fundamental thing. The higher difficulty forces you to use the Devil Breakers primarily as a defensive tool rather than an offensive one, meaning that effectively a lot of the more offensive Devil Breakers just don't really offer what you need in those situations. Finally, at the very end of the game, Nero gets access to his grab mechanic, as well as a Devil Trigger form. The DT form is nice. It trades out a lot of Vergil and Dante's tankiness in their DT for speed and power, which I enjoy. I'm glad things like Maximum Bet and Showdown make a return because they are just really fun to use, and they also require good timing because both of them are charge wind-up focused. If an enemy interrupts you in the middle of them or you're not positioned right, you're just not going to get them off properly. One minor critique I have is that his summon swords, I don't know what they do. It feels like they have very little synergy with the rest of his kit and don't really need to be there as more than a, pretty decently cool reference to Vergil. If anyone in the comments does know what these summon swords do, I'd be really interested to know. Nero's Devil Arm grab is really nice. It's a cherry on top that just adds that extra bit onto his combat. You don't get it originally because, like in DMC4, you just would have been able to cheese the entire base game if you have it. But now you get it for higher difficulties and you can mess around with it, learning what all the different grabs do. And this adds really good replay incentive through its introduction. And, much like Wire Snatch, it has a lot more specific timing to how you use it. Overall, Nero is such a massive improvement in game design since DMC4. I really enjoy messing around with Devil Breakers and the raw dopamine hit of hitting Max Act perfectly. DMC5 takes the lesson of him not really growing out of being a Training Wheels character in 4 and messes with it, adding new and fun mechanics to him in a reasonable pace that keeps him interesting. However, I can also see why people don't like him. His heavy reliance on timing being perfect can make him feel quite samey, and his kit doesn't provide nearly as much room for experimental strategies as Dante or Vergil. You are also decently punished for not mastering those timings. His damage without exceed on higher difficulties can feel absolutely abysmal, as I mentioned earlier, which I really don't like. Breaking Devil Breakers as you use them is a good mechanic, but I can understand why some people may feel frustrated for being punished for using them with the wrong timing. It can feel with Nero like the game is constantly pushing you on the back foot, constantly forcing you to have perfect timing, where on other characters you can be a lot more lax. and this is precisely what to me makes him feel the worst to play on higher difficulties. Even though I do like him as a character, he is very much forced onto the defensive constantly, as you constantly need to avoid being hit in order to get off good combos, and without his Devil Breakers he has less active mobility than Dante. What he gained in having a higher skill ceiling, I think he did lose somewhat as a training character, which is fine. It doesn't feel like they quite struck the perfect balance between being good for beginners and fun for experts, but overall, he is just such a massive, massive improvement on everything that he was in DMC4. And I still really enjoy playing him, even if he is flawed. Speaking of characters that are very much Marmite in terms of the way that the player base feels about them, let's talk about V. The element that V aims to teach within the game's combat is positioning. Essentially, he wants to teach the player how to distance yourself perfectly away from enemies while attacking to ensure you don't get hit and mess up that juicy combo. Distancing is the main element that runs throughout all his kit, that defines who he is, and that can be seen best through his main mechanic, his summons. V is very unique as a character because he doesn't fight himself. He summons 3 AI summons to attack for him that you can control using button inputs. There's his melee summon, Shadow, which disrupts enemies at close range with sharp, pointy strikes. Then there's his ranged summon, Griffin, which attacks with lightning blasts that zone and deal constant DPS to the enemy. Finally, there's his Hail Mary Devil Trigger, Nightmare, which allows him to summon a giant golem that shoots lasers from its face. The golem is slow, but can take out an entire room full of enemies incredibly quickly with insane damage. However, its reach on its basic combos is very limited, and it can only control a set area around itself. So, all of these summons are pretty great. They can be used at any distance in the room, so V can hang out on the other end of a combat arena and do nothing while spamming buttons and letting all his summons kill everything. Sounds like an easy brain-rotted playstyle, right? Yes, but not quite. There is an element introduced to kind of try and break this up, and that is the fact that V cannot kill enemies without finishing them off with his cane first. He has to get close and do a long cane animation finisher in order to be able to properly kill an enemy, otherwise they just keep coming back to life. The cane finisher also acts as this really satisfying kick of sudden style points that builds up your meter massively each time you do it, making it feel viscerally satisfying to use, which I really like. And this helps keep V engaging and really will be the only mechanic keeping you engaged while playing V because his summons feel so detached, but we'll get back to that. This introduces our positioning element. V is very frail but needs to get close to finish off enemies properly. However, this obviously puts him in danger, with limited dodging options open to him. So this aims to introduce a risk versus reward dynamic, which should make his gameplay incredibly entertaining. Adding on to this, he has very little mobility by himself. He needs to recall Shadow in order to dash, and Griffin in order to jump, meaning that you have to balance out your aggression with what's coming at you. Certain attacks are best dodged with Shadow, and other attacks are best dodged with Griffin. Certain enemies are better dealt with by Shadow, certain enemies are better dealt with by Griffin. It's this duality that should keep you constantly switching up what summons you use, keep your brain constantly thinking how you're going to approach this encounter. It aims to be a very tactical approach to a character. Finally, just to keep it extra interesting, your summons aren't immune to damage. They actually have individual health bars, and if it falls to 0, they will fall into a state known as stalemate, where their core will be revealed like Shadow from DMC1, and they will be unable to do anything or assist you. Now, the cores will regenerate on their own over a set amount of time, but you can assist this by positioning V close to them, putting you at risk once again if you want your damage and dodge options back up.
This means V constantly has to be playing a balance game, keeping summons alive versus attacking the enemy, where V needs to be at a certain moment to get the most strategical advantage out of his summons without losing them. And if he does lose his summon, do you approach the summon as V, or do you hang back and make sure you don't take any more damage? So it is in your best interest to constantly keep your summon's health maintained, which you can do by recalling them to you using the dodge and jump inputs respectively, and Devil Trigger can also do this. These mechanics enforce a strong reliance on positioning, and slam home those timing lessons that Nero aims to teach you. V does teach these concepts to a player very, very well, and it does improve on the gameplay of the other Zoner in Devil May Cry. Lady, very nice. Say what you will about V, but you could definitely say he's a lot more entertaining to play than Lady was. However, he does definitely have his issues. I went into this review really not wanting to be a V hater, because it is so easy to be a V hater, but there's a reason why it's easy to be a V hater. He just does not feel as good as the other characters in the game. When you play Nero or Dante, there's this visceral satisfaction to getting combos out. With Nero, you're constantly dashing between enemies, using different devil breakers, you're in the heat of the moment. With Dante, you're constantly plotting what weapon are you going to use next, how are you going to stylishly style on this enemy. With V, there's none of that. With V, you can just hang around at the back of a combat encounter, wait until it's your time to attack something, jump up, teleport to it, kill it, run back to the back of the combat counter. All of V's fights push him onto the defensive, and don't keep up that constant sense of I'm taking down the demons, I'm the one in control, which makes Nero and Dante so fun. I think if I were to best express my problems with V, they're twofold. For one, V himself does way too little. Yes, the Cane Finisher is a beautifully satisfying cap on gameplay, and you can do some relatively interesting stuff like raining canes down from the sky to finish off multiple enemies with the right input. But that's it. As I said before, he just lacks the necessary weight and punch and involvement in the combat that the other characters feel. It feels like I'm not playing V, I'm playing Shadow, Griffin, and Nightmare. It loses all of the weight of the action, and V just feels like a passive bystander in his own game. But my second issue is that V isn't given anything to test this specific skill set. They came up with this really complex, wonderful approach to a character, with lots of intricacies in the macro and micro of how you use your demons. And none of the encounters V gets specifically test that. He's given the least missions of any character by a very large margin, and one of those missions is just kind of reused content from other missions. So effectively, he's given, I'd say, 4 real missions, and in those 4, you fight Nidhogg, who is a fun enough boss, and I can see how he tests some of V's skills, but not really to the degree that I would expect, and not really in a way that feels fun. He feels completely out of place when facing the Garyon Knight, which is a very high-octane, fast-paced battle that V can't really do anything in. His shadows are just running around this giant arena, desperately trying to keep up with the teleporting knight, and it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like it was made for a character like V. And finally, there's his mission searching for the Devil Sword Spada, which is pretty cool and does have some interesting environmental interactability with Nightmare, but again, no specific test that feels interesting for V to face. This means that you have this really complex, excellently designed character with nothing that forces you to play around and experiment with him. There's a reason why on all of the platinum guides for V, there's a big disclaimer saying, hey, if you want to just put this character on auto and let him play for you, you will have more fun than playing the real character itself, and probably do better on the high difficulty missions. And yeah, in general, with V, As I've kind of touched on, there's this constant disconnection between the player and the character. The idea of a summon character in DMC is very fun. The idea of a zoner character in DMC is very fun. But neither V nor Lady can get around this feeling of just being completely disconnected and isolated from what's going on. This is something that, in this case, could definitely have been fixed by just some better and more interesting mission design for V to play around with. It feels like they looked at Nero and Dante and expected V to be played in the exact same ways, and held V to Nero and Dante's standards as a character, rather than designing anything unique and fun around him. And yeah, all of these problems coalesce into a design that is very much an acquired taste. I can see why people like him, he's just not for me. I just wish more attention was paid to him, and that he could have been made into a much cooler, more fleshed out character that the community would have more of a strong feeling on at large. Finally capping off the main trio, there's the infamous Dante. Dante embodies the element of variety, choosing what strategy is most appropriate for the enemy type, or most stylish for the situation, and building on the skill set that the other two have enforced. Dante in this game is an insanely complex character, matched only possibly by his DMC4 incarnation. Dante has 4 main melee weapons. Each one of them has some kind of alternate form or big gimmick to it to play around with. Dante gets 3 different swords in this game: Rebellion, which works roughly how it usually does, Spada, which changes up some of Rebellion's combos with more of an emphasis on mix-ups and keeping the enemy in the air, and the main one, Devil's Sword Dante, which is able to summon 4 summon swords which can complete an action based on what stance you're in. In Trickster, they enable you to gain an extra dash. In Swordmaster, they slash around you and follow whatever attack you're doing. In Royal Guard, they make the parry timing easier and the penalty for failing a parry less harsh. And in Gunslinger, they do what they should do and be shot at the enemy. Balrog is the obligatory punch-kick weapon, except in this incarnation, your punches and kicks are actually entirely separate movesets. The punches are much faster and like a boxer now, which come at the enemy with a lot more speed but a lot less damage. However, with each punch you build up a 10 count combo meter. When you reach 10, your fists ignite, dealing extra damage, enabling you access to new moves, like True Impact. Then you've got the kick part of Balrog, which is much slower, but gives you a little bit extra range and mobility, while dealing more damage per hit. However, the kick does not have the combo meter, requiring you to hold down the main attack input in order to do like this breakdancing move, which sets Dante alight, but renders you vulnerable for a couple of seconds while he does it. Then there's everybody's favourite, Cavaliere, a motorcycle that can be split up into 2 circular saws. It is by far the slowest weapon in the game. If you mash the attack input while attacking an enemy, you can break down their armor and do constant damage. Or, if you use Swordmaster, you can get on the bike itself and ride it into a group of enemies, pulling wheelies while you do massive damage in an area. And then there's the most complex of all of them. King Cerberus is the new version of Cerberus, which instead of just being a simple pair of ice nunchucks, is all at once the ice nunchucks, which have all of the moves the ice nunchucks used to have. Then, if you hold down the attack input, it transforms into a 3-section lightning staff, which can use upgraded, higher damaging versions of its existing moves, just with a lightning spin on them that do extra stun. And finally, if you use it in Swordmaster, it can become a flaming staff, which has great reach and deals massive damage to enemies if you manage to get its long flowing combos off. All 4 of these weapons are, at base, already insanely fun. Each one of them has their own uses, their own ups, and their own downs. Personally, I'm a really big fan of Balrog and King Cerberus. Devil Sword Dante is okay. I much prefer using Rebellion both aesthetically and in terms of gameplay, but Rebellion clearly isn't what the game wants you to use, so I stuck with Devil Sword Dante, even though I know there is a bunch of cool tech to it. I don't know, I just prefer using Rebellion. Cavalieri, I was never quite able to get my hand around. I really like using it in Swordmaster style, where Dante rides on it and jumps into groups of enemies for like a big end combo finisher, but I wasn't really able to get into the flow of like quick switching to it. It always just felt, because it was so much slower than all of my other combos, that like I was playing really hard and fast, and then I just like was swinging a hippo at my enemy essentially. It just didn't feel right to me, but I can see why people like it. Then, after all of those 4 weapons, it gets even more complex, because now there's 4 guns. You've got the pistols, which work how the pistols always have, with a charge shot function, which, unlike Nero's explosion, now is like a triple shot, basically, allowing you to shoot faster, deal a bit more DPS and stun enemies, but not having the same oomph that Nero's charge shot has, which makes sense. Ebony and Ivory feel alright. They've fallen very much into a nice niche in this game, where they're good for keeping enemies like up in the air with combos, and good for extending combos, but they're obviously not a main form of damage. I think they've really balanced Ebony and Ivory out perfectly over the series of the games, to where they feel like what they should be in a game like this. An accessory tool, kind of. Then there's the shotgun, which feels okay. I've definitely preferred other shotguns in the series more. It's very there. I wish this slot was taken up with a different weapon, maybe. There's definitely tech to the shotgun, and it's an alright weapon, but it's not one that I would like find myself switching to that often. Then there's the Kalina Ann, which is as cool as the Kalina Ann always is, but this time, oh boy, it's better, because there's 2 of them. And when you equip both Kalina Anns, you get access to a host of new moves, including a giant laser cannon, which, yeah, that's just insanely cool. And finally, the Gambling Hat. Lucifer is a very unique weapon, and fulfills the slot of the game's weirdo weapon. Essentially, you throw red orbs into a blender and shoot them at enemies. Now, this uses an insane amount of red orbs, in exchange for an insane amount of damage, especially at max rank. You could literally go through the entire game on Dante Must Die in a breeze because of how much damage this weapon does. And that is one of my main problems with it, but we'll get to that. The main mechanic behind Lucifer is that you balance out your gambling with getting more red orbs. Essentially, when you pull off its gunslinger move, where you spin your hat around or throw your hat onto an enemy, it places like a funny little hat onto an enemy's head, and damaging them will drop red orbs based on how much you use. You're meant to use this as a kind of red orb economy, where you're balancing out using these high damage Lucifer blows with getting more red orbs from your enemy by punching and kicking them with combos. This is a really fun system. However, the problem is, Lucifer is absolutely butt-fuck broken late game, especially because there are many methods that you can use to just kind of get red orbs for free, and when you do that, Lucifer just has like insane finisher moves, like dropping giant red meteors from the sky that can one-shot even the hardest bosses on the highest difficulty. I find this really fun, but at the same time it feels like a bit of a balancing issue that this can just be abused to this degree. I don't know, I kind of wish there was a little bit more to Lucifer, and not that it was more underpowered, but that it was more difficult to get strong use out of Lucifer. The guns are, I would say, probably the best balance they've ever been, between being an essential part of Dante's kit, while not being able to single-handedly solo the entire game, at least if you count out Lucifer. Then there's the 4 stances. Trickster is the same as it always is, extra dodges and you teleport around. Swordmaster gives you really fun new moves on all of the weapons. I've kind of gone through all of the main Swordmaster stuff already, so I won't run back through it, but it is really fun in this game. and I found myself constantly switching to it, even more than in DMC4. It feels really useful. Gunslinger has been really well balanced out, I think. I found myself using it a lot less in DMC4, just because I was having more fun using Trickster and Swordmaster, and I didn't feel like that there were that many tools that I wanted to use it for, but it is really fun in this game, especially with all of the utility you can get out of Lucifer and Kalina and with Royal Guard was insanely difficult to master in DMC4, but now it feels a lot more forgiving. Timings are generally a bit more generous, and it feels like even a more novice user of Royal Guard can get the hang of it, so that you're parrying the occasional attack where you see an opportunity. I'm absolutely terrible at parrying, and I got relatively used to it. Finally, there have been some changes to his DT. In his Devil Trigger, you now get access to summoned swords based on your stance, which complete the actions that I outlined earlier when talking about Devil Sword Dante. This adds a little bit of extra spice to Dante's Devil Trigger and makes it a bit more fun to use, which I appreciate, especially since it's now got competition in the form of Sin Devil Trigger. Sin Devil Trigger is Dante's ultimate form, and you need to funnel your Devil Trigger gauge into it in order to access it. Essentially, you get 30 seconds of being not an invincible, but an overpowered god, floating around the arena, slashing your sword, unleashing giant strikes, and several insanely fun finisher moves, which are related to Dante's inputs. Particularly, I'm not sure on the name, but the one where you shoot all the little homing missiles at enemies, and Judgment, the one where you suck an enemy into a black hole, both of those are insanely fun to use in this form, and generally, it's just a really well executed, ultimate mode for a character. There's a very nice balance and interplay between it and regular Devil Trigger, as Sin Devil Trigger is a lot harder to access, and you lose access to regular Devil Trigger if you're trying to go for it. So you actively have to hold off on using Devil Trigger in order to get your big mode. And when you do get your big mode, you're not exactly immune to damage either. You have far less options for actually dodging and resisting damage from outside sources. So it's really good for funneling down one strong enemy or boss, but if you're surrounded by loads, you will end up taking damage in this form. Anyway, this is easily Dante's most complex iteration, with every option you have having a fully realized moveset and purpose. His arsenal is absolutely fantastic, as I've already outlined. There's so many options and so much choice, he just feels a treat to use. However, he can be very overwhelming, especially for newer players. And I think this is an area where the game's enforced character switching really hurts it. It is so hard to get a handle on Dante. If you're not already an expert going into DMC5, you play 2 missions as Dante and you're just starting to get the hang of what he does and how he feels, and then it's, oh, you're playing V. Oh, you're playing Nero. 2 completely different characters that have completely different functions and are nowhere near even in the same realm as complicated to figure out as Dante. Additionally, some parts do feel a little bit redundant from my perspective. I obviously don't know the full potential of his arsenal because I'm not an expert, so someone can feel free to correct me. I definitely feel like the shotgun and Cavalieri in particular are kind of letdowns for me. However, I do really like the increase in micro difficulty with learning his individual weapons. With the individual forms and the combos that those forms have, it feels like I'm rewarded again for learning specific weapons like I was in DMC3, which was the thing I felt was a shame with DMC4 Dante. The lack of individual interesting combos to use with weapons, and the lack of complexity within weapons in general. Overall, yeah, he's a really fun character, and really good at his job. The only things that hurt him are issues with wider game design. Vergil, meanwhile, remains relatively similar to his DMC4 incarnation. He has 3 main weapons, his summoned swords, and his concentration mechanic.
And again, he feels absolutely amazing to play. Definitely even better here because of the stronger enemy design and more smooth camera control, which makes using his trick up and trick down feel more natural. He's great at being both this ridiculously overpowered boss character that does 1 million damage and has screen wipe moves that murder all of the enemies, as well as being a character that has shitloads of mechanical depth if you want to learn him. A beginner can pick him up and have loads and loads of fun, while a master can spend ages trying to reach his skill ceiling, and that makes him, honestly, in my opinion, kinda the perfect Devil May Cry character. He's interesting because he builds up all of the skills that the characters have been teaching you and crystallizes them into one full moveset. He tests your timing because he gets stronger if you release certain moves with the right timing. As well, you also need good timing to know when to use his screen wipe moves, because of their long wind-up animations. Additionally, he needs good positioning for trick-ups and trick-downs, as well as managing his concentration resource, which goes up when you stand still posing at an enemy, and it also goes up as you hit them, but you lose the concentration resource if you get hit yourself or jump recklessly. And that is really, really interesting, because while you're playing this kind of brain-rotted, overpowered character, you're being punished for playing your brain-rotted, overpowered character in a way that is brain-rotted. You have to still be thinking while you're playing. Finally, there's the aspect of variety. He has 3 different weapons, each with very different movesets and very different bonuses and downsides. Yamato feels absolutely amazing, beautifully weighty and punchy, and attacks like Judgment Cut and Judgment Cut End are just... we all already know how gorgeous they are. Beowulf also feels great, though not quite as nice as it does in DMC3. It's nice to see some of its iconic moves return, as well as some new moves, and it balances very nicely between attacking with Yamato and then having a much closer, more high-damaging combo machine. And then finally, you've got his summoned copy of Force Edge, which also feels absolutely great and bounces very nicely off of the other 2 weapons in his kit. His doppelganger mode is very, very fun. I love that they took the mechanic from the DMC reboot where you could change the speed of the doppelganger and the delay between your and its attacks, but they actually made the doppelganger feel a lot better and more intuitive with where it goes and what moves it uses. Balancing using his super moves with using his Sin Devil trigger is a really fun bit of resource management as well, constantly keeping you thinking, do I want to screen wipe these enemies or go into Vergil's big mode and strike them down? I would only say that his Sin Devil trigger, by contrast, feels very underwhelming. I wish there was a bit more source to its moves, like what Dante has. I know Doppelganger is currently taking up the spot of where his Devil Trigger would normally be, but I don't know, I just wish there was something a bit more to the Sin Devil Trigger. Maybe there's something I'm missing though. Anyway, overall, Vergil is fantastic, because as I said before, he manages to perfectly tread that fine line between being absolutely insanely overpowered and being fun for new and old players to enjoy, allowing you to up your damage and do even crazier things through perfect mastery of the 3 skills I've outlined. I think my literal only main complaint with him is that when playing his campaign he can feel absolutely awful to use in platforming sections, but I guess we're lucky that there aren't that many. Anyway, let's talk about enemy design. Enemy design is on the whole much, much better than the previous entries in the series. The other games had this massive problem with poorly implemented gimmick designs within their enemy that force you to use only one specific weapon or strategy to beat certain enemies in battle. Think about the Fallen, or the Blitzes, or the Soul Eaters being some of the worst and most miserable experiences in their respective games. For the most part though, DMC5 is completely absent of all of this. All of the designs have a variety of ways in which that they can be beaten, and a variety of skills that they reward you for using. A strong example of this is the Hell Antenora. They are demon berserkers which enter an uninterruptible stance when they're knocked over. This forces you to strategize around this. as you won't be able to just stand there and keep wailing on them, or they'll hit you and deal damage and break your combo. So, you have to figure out a way to get around it, and there are multiple routes you can go down, all of which are pretty easy to access, and allow for lots of unique player expression in terms of how exactly you go about doing it. For example, you could wait for them to enter their stance and then parry their attack, giving you an extra opening in which to attack them back. You could also, if you're skilled enough, approach the fight in such a way in which the Hell Antenora never hits the floor, never triggering this berserk state, allowing you to move the Hell Antenora as you wish. You could also, when you're fighting with Nero, use just a load of Buster Spam, continuously slamming the Antenora against the floor, but never allowing it to enter its berserk state. Or you could simply just wait the berserk state out, jumping out of the way or rolling out of the way and waiting for him to make his slash. And any of these are completely valid strategies for beating this enemy. The gimmick does not force you, the player, into one line of reasoning that you're forced to use against it. There is so much room for player expression within this enemy, and it's not even one of the better ones in the game. Even the Fury, said to be one of the most miserable experiences in this game, on the level of something like the Blitz from DMC4, is actually a lot better than most people give it credit for. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not going to stand up here on some kind of high horse and go, actually you see the Fury is just massively misunderstood and you're just bad because you don't get it. It is a fundamentally frustrating design. However, it is nowhere near as bad as something like the Blitz, where you were forced to just passively stand by and do nothing. The Fury encourages you to try and parry its blows in order to knock it down. It's considerably less tanky than the Blitz, and doesn't have a million different forms, and can't only be damaged by long-range attacks while it's in its jumping around state. It may be annoying, but it allows you to do things like parry, or dodge and wait until it's in a vulnerable state, which it does have. It actually has vulnerable states where you can use melee to knock it out of its current combo, knock it to the ground, and combo it until it dies. It may be unfun, it may be more demanding than all of the other enemies in the game, but it is not subject to that same central design flaw that all of the games up to this point have been suffering from. I am so happy it's finally gone. It only took them 20 years to get the full idea that maybe in a game based around giving you as many options as possible and encouraging the player to find stylish new routes to skill expression through those, that it's maybe not the best idea to have enemies that can only be beaten in one specific way. I would say certain enemies though do definitely have a problem with being way too tanky. The Fury, although I just sang its praises in terms of some areas of balance, is a little bit too tanky for what it is. It would be a hell of a lot more fun if it was a full offensive type weapon that could be knocked to the ground once and then defeated. And then you could afford to make those timings a little bit more razor sharp as well, which would make it even more fun to deal with. I think people wouldn't have as much of a problem with Furies if it weren't for the fact that when you do catch them out, you then have to do 2 full rotations in order to actually kill them. Proto, Angelo, and Behemoth are also really good examples of where the enemies do skew to being far too tanky, although you can make an argument that it does work for them because of what they are. Overall, a real striking win for enemy design here though. Boss design wise, yeah, it's very similar to DMC3 in that there's a lot of standout bangers, but also quite a few stinkers that kind of malign the roster for me. Especially really noteworthy duds in my opinion, like Gilgamesh or kind of Nidhogg, although Nidhogg's a little bit more in the middle. I think the main reason I'd actively put its boss roster below something like DMC3 is just the infinite amount of Urizen repeats. Urizen is a fight that works brilliantly once.
and maybe twice if you consider his getting up form, but even the getting up form doesn't have the same punch and enjoyment as it does the first time you fight him, when he sat down in that chair, regally simply doing nothing, farming aura points while you have to helplessly dodge all of his ranged attacks in the background, finally getting a few quick hits in before being forced to dodge back. But when you have this fight repeated 4 fucking times, the entire gimmick with breaking the crystal before you can actually do anything to him really gets painfully old so quickly. And it's a shame too, because that final fight with him is actually such a banger. It's just preceded by just constant repeats of the same boss with no change, and it's so boring every time. Furthermore, there is a real problem where good fights get given to the wrong character. For example, as I mentioned before with V and Geryon. The Elder Geryon Knight is such a cool concept for a boss that would fit in really well with a character like Nero or Dante. Just imagine if with Nero you were able to counter his time stop with your own ragtime, creating a strategic and fast-paced fight, but instead you're with V, constantly trying to figure out where the hell your summons have gone, why the hell they aren't right in front of the boss, and constantly being outpaced at all times. However, as much as I have complained, the bangers are really, really good. Vergil, obviously I don't even need to mention, goes completely off the fucking rails, but Cavalieri and Malphus are 2 real standouts of bosses that just feel insanely fun to fight, with the amount of parrying that you can do in Cavalieri to break his shield, or Malphus's teleporting gimmick just being really, really fun and well utilized within her fight. Overall, it is a really strong set of enemy and boss designs. DMC3 definitely did have higher peaks, even if it had slightly worse consistency, but god, I'm just so glad that bad gimmick design is gone now. One of my biggest, all-encompassing criticisms of this game, though, is its level design. Hey, do you guys want to know a gamer secret that nobody else knows? Did you know that Devil May Cry began its life as Resident Evil, and as such was a blend of action, puzzles, exploration, and platforming elements? A blend which I really, really enjoy and added a bunch of variety and interesting aspects to levels. Well, now it's not. Now, the level design is the biggest problem that I have with this game, where it used to be one of my biggest praises in DMC1. Obviously, as the combat gets better, puzzles and exploration will naturally become secondary. This is fine. But when the balance begins to shift too far in the opposite direction, the entire game just becomes long encounter corridors. And that's just a little boring to me. There's no spice to the level design, no zest, no interesting puzzles or interesting mechanics that add something to a mission in the game, that make it memorable and stand out from others. I may not like it, but the ghost ship level in DMC1 will always stick in my mind as one of the most standout moments from that game. It's such an interesting level because of its weird mechanics. And again, the Wheel of Fortune level in DMC3, where you're constantly having to realign the tower. Awful gimmick, but a level I will always remember. The key is just like with enemy design, finding a way to make those puzzles fun, rather than just deleting them from the game entirely. The few puzzles that are in this game are just so boring and meaningless that they might as well not exist. Oh yeah, go around and pop a couple zits to unlock some doors. Oh yeah, go grab the weird brain tick thing, walk 5 meters and then put it in the tree. They just don't add anything to these levels or make them memorable. They're just there to be there. At that point, I'd rather not have them in, because they just feel like uninteresting obstructions to gameplay that add very, very little to the overall game. We're given really cool potential platforming tools. Nero has a grappling hook. Dante can fly. V can teleport and use his summons. Why are there no levels or ideas based around this? One of my biggest praises for DMC Devil May Cry was the platforming. It was a action-oriented game with quite simple level design on the face of it, but it used its levels and the way that Dante could interact with them in a really unique and fun way that kept a constant spice. You never knew whether you were going to turn a corner and face an encounter, or face a really cool jumping puzzle that you could use your grappling hooks to navigate. The game just wastes all of these cool ideas in favor of like maybe one or two grapple hook sections for Nero that once again feel there more just, to have them there. And without it, it just leads to levels feeling very dry and samey. I feel variety is, as always, the spice of life in these games. This is what made DMC5 just so difficult to replay for me. I found all of the levels just felt like it was one long drag. And don't get me wrong, the combat is insanely fun, the enemies are insanely fun, and doing that helps keep the light of the game alive, but without anything in the interstitial period, no interesting mechanics, no interesting puzzles, it's just run to the next combat arena, put the thing in the thing, run to the next combat arena, put the thing in the thing. It's just such a boring gameplay loop, I find. And don't get me wrong, 1, 3, and 4, as I've already mentioned, were not perfect in these aspects. Some of those puzzles absolutely sucked. But how about we make them not suck? Make them interesting ways to get around the level. DMC Devil May Cry absolutely nailed this. When it did puzzles, they were engaging and fun, like the safe door puzzle in Mission 17, where you had to enter 4 separate rooms in an area, activate glyphs on the floor by killing enemies within a certain zone, then return to the central area and unlock the safe door using a puzzle mechanism. That is such a fun combination of puzzle and gameplay that allows the combat to shine and the level design to shine. Instead, we only get the combat shining, and it only feels like half a game. Another problem I find is that the levels are lacking severely in terms of variety of structure. Each level is now entirely self-contained, so the game is literally, as I've said, just a singular set corridor of encounters, which is fine. But there is room within that frame to make the environments and levels stand out as interesting and unique from each other, instead of just a tunnel where you move from one combat encounter to the next. There's some potentially unique stuff introduced in the Qliphotht with these blood vessel veins that pump you to different areas, but they're entirely linear. Imagine if they weren't. Imagine if there were branching paths within the Qliphotht that took you to different areas, that challenged you in different ways. That would be so fun, and make the level so much more replayable instead of just going, boop, now I'm in the place I need to be. My next major issue comes with mission structure itself. I've already touched on this, but being forced to play as set characters, even when you're not on the first playthrough, can be very, very frustrating for some players, especially if you don't like the character you're playing. I've already mentioned how V is very much a Marmite character. Some people hate him, some people love him. But regardless of whether or not you hate him or love him, being forced to play him when he's already not one of the strongest characters in the game just exacerbates any problems you may have with him. It just makes you not want to replay the game if you don't like those characters. If you like all three, then good for you. Have loads of fun. But if you don't, you're forced to constantly slog through levels of V or Nero or Dante if you don't like any of the three. And that just makes it unfun, especially because it creates hitches in that system of smoothly progressing from learning one character to another that I mentioned before. It's not a constant build-up where you're building and building and building in complexity. You go from Nero, who's quite simple, V, who's pretty complex, to Dante, who is an absolute nuclear bomb of knowledge, but then you jump back down to V, and then back down to Nero, and then back up to Dante, and then back down to V, and then back up to Nero. And the worst part about these levels is that not only is level allocation pretty unfair, the actual things that you need to do within the levels are not remotely unique to any of these characters, besides maybe 1 or 2 times that you use Grim Grip as Nero, you could play this level as Dante. You could reskin it to work for Dante and it wouldn't matter. So what is the point in having these levels be specifically tailored to these characters if any one of the characters can fit the mold within the level? There is no point. It's purely for narrative purposes of having this sense of building up a story by hopping between different characters, and that is great for the story. For the gameplay, it's a massive, massive hole that both alienates certain players and just makes the game feel, in general, worse, because the game is not designed around it in any meaningful way. The one thing they do try and add, which is the mechanic of some levels being mutually shared between characters, so you can play Mission 7 as V or Nero, is pretty interesting in concept. However, that's all it is. It's interesting in concept. It's cool to see Nero fighting demons on the other side of the wall, but it doesn't really add anything to the gameplay. These levels are also always completely bland. If they required some sort of cooperation or building off of having the other character there, that would be really, really fun and make these levels unique and stand out. As is, they're just there, and there's only 2 of them anyway. Why couldn't we pick what character we use in more levels? Or better yet, and this is my main area for improvement in this game, why couldn't we just have a character select screen for these missions? And I'll go into how I would build around that narratively later on in my conclusion, but I'm gonna end up on this section for way too long if I get into that now, so let's move on. It is overall a definite strong weak point in the game. I do not like the level design one bit. What it's gained in enemy design, it is definitely lost in level design. However, the combat being as good as it is does mitigate that significantly. Upgrades are back to being purchased with red orbs again. The Proud Souls mechanic is gone, and so is the white orb mechanic from DMC Reboot. Red orbs are now shared between characters, like they should be, and like DMC Devil May Cry, upgrade pricing is a lot better spaced, so it is harder to reach an end game where you have loads and loads of red orbs and nothing to do with them, although you still will reach that point. You'll be good for a couple more playthroughs. You will be encouraged to replay in order to get everything that you want. Additionally, Dante's Faust rewarding you for gathering more red orbs makes it so when you do hit that endgame, red orbs aren't this pointless resource that sits there vacuously and does nothing. Health and DT is upgraded via blue and purple orbs respectively, as usual. These can be bought in the shop, found in secret missions, or collected around the map. And it is a really small change, but I love that they have finally made it so purple orbs can be collected at areas around the map or in secret missions. It just means that they feel more like an actual part of the game than like this side upgrade that you have to go into the shop and buy. Secret missions are generally a lot easier to access now. Instead of being like a door hidden away in some random part of the arena, or worse like it was in DMC2, just like touching a random part of the wall, DMC5 secret missions are found with glyphs on the wall that you have to get a complete view of in order to access the secret mission. This is a cool way of rewarding exploration, even though there's not that much exploring to be done in these levels, and is a neat way of accessing the secret missions. In terms of secret mission balancing, they're pretty on point. They feel challenging enough, while not feeling so challenging that it is now impossible to get your health upgrades, so fuck you. Again, just a really nice balancing out of one of the more sticky areas of the series. And this is generally somewhere where I feel like DMC5 has made real solid improvements. The one thing I am kinda sad about is the disappearance of old items. They were not exactly something which I made great use of in the older Devil May Cry games, but it was nice to see that they were there. They just added a little bit of extra flair, and I kind of miss them as a little bit of personality the game had, even though I know why they removed them. Now, in terms of difficulty, DMC5 has 4 main proper difficulties. Human, Easy Mode, Devil Hunter, which is the intended experience for the game, and probably the most fun way to play it. Son of Sparda, which remixes enemy encounters with harder enemies, and also dramatically increases enemy health and damage. Also a pretty fun way to play the game. And Dante Must Die, which as usual adds Devil Trigger to all of the enemies after a certain time delay, makes enemies generally a lot harder to defeat, and adds certain cool little niche mechanics and gimmicks to certain fights, which you won't get on other difficulties. DMD can be fun sometimes, especially on specific really fun bosses, like Vergil, Cavalieri, and Malphus, but suffers a lot from making enemies far too tanky. I just think in general, one of the areas in which these games have had a massive problem is that they focus too much on increasing difficulty by scaling enemy health. Now, that's fine in some games. In some games, increasing enemy health is a good and fun way to increase difficulty because your skills are tested against that enemy for longer. However, in DMC, the entire flow of the combat is based and pre-dedicated around being able to feel like you're constantly the main character, constantly doing damage, constantly making progress, and on higher difficulties, I don't want to feel like I'm slapping a wet noodle against a wall with giant cannons attached. I want to feel like I'm in a rapid, fast-paced battle with an enemy who will die, but deals immense amounts of damage for every fuck-up I make, so that it pushes me on that razor wire of tension of knowing the game's mechanics well enough. If you increased enemy aggression and damage tenfold from current Dante Must Die, but toned enemy health down to where it is on like Devil Hunter or Human, I genuinely believe the game would be so much more fun as a result. Further from this, there are 3 challenge difficulties. Heaven and Hell remains pointless as ever, I'm not going to go into that. Then there's Heaven or Hell, which is essentially playing a Son of Sparda no-hit run. It's pretty fun. You don't get checkpoints for it, like you did with the last Heaven or Hell in DMC4, so it is a hell of a lot more punishing if you get things wrong. And definitely not a mode I think most casual players will exactly flock to, but it is a really fun challenge for those that are interested. My favourite challenge mode does make a return though, Legendary Dark Knight, where enemy spawns are like quintupled or something crazy like that, so you end up fighting a shitload of enemies in a certain room. This is really just dumb fun. Yes, it can be frustrating at times, especially when you end up fighting like 4 Furies, but it's just complete silliness, I really love it. Especially with bullshit characters like Vergil or Dante. And finally, there's the Bloody Palace, which has completed its evolution into being far more simplistic, probably the most simple of any of them in the series. It's 101 floors, you travel up 1 floor at a time, defeating the enemies on that floor, and every 10 floors you'll get a special encounter. These special encounters alternate between being a really hard spawn of enemy and being a set boss. And other than that, it doesn't really have any interesting tricks or mechanics to throw at you. Just a very simple climb up the tower, beat all the enemies and beat all the bosses. And honestly, it's still good fun, purely because playing DMC5 is good fun. I do miss all of the interesting and varied mechanics for climbing the tower from DMC3, but I can see why people are kind of glad those might be gone. However, the one aspect I really don't like is the timer. I feel like it adds very little, other than just like, I guess a speedrunning thing of seeing how much time you can build up, but to me it always just felt a bit like it was just sort of hanging there, not really doing anything, because you gain enough time from killing enemies that you're never really in trouble of losing all that time and losing because of that. Now, moving on to 100% completion, I have not 100% completed this game, but I am pretty close, about like 90%, but I think that's the way it's gonna stay. Unfortunately for me, S-ranking all those missions is just such an annoying and unfun grind that I just end up in a state where I kind of hate DMC5. And I don't want to end up in a state where I hate a game I'm reviewing. I think way too many of these reviews of mine have been slightly negatively tinged by the fact that I've played the game way too many times and pushed it past its stress point in terms of how fun it can be. Or at least my stress point in terms of how much fun I can have playing it. But I do feel like there is an essence of a lack of replayability, especially when it comes to DMC5's drought in terms of good level design. But yeah, that annoying grind fest for S-ranks absolutely killed me, not because I found that I couldn't do it, but more because I found that I was just bored doing it, chewing my way through so many levels that felt samey, and even the combat, which is really nice and fun, just felt like a grind slog once you get to the point where you've replayed the game through about 6 or 7 times. That said, you don't necessarily have to listen to that too heavily. It is tinged with a lot of personal opinion on how the game structures its levels. I may just be a grumpy, curmudgeonly fool who has played this game way too many times for his own good. In terms of graphics and art direction, I do actually have a little bit more to say than I do usually. The blanket use of the RE Resident Evil engine across most of Capcom's games has done irreparable damage to their art direction, or at least to some of them. Now, this may just be my bitching, whining, and complaining, but I really don't like hyper-realistic looking games. I like it when my games have a stylistic edge or twinge to them that makes them not look exactly the same as how they would in reality. And I feel that hyper-realism often robs a game of its unique sense of visual style and visual language. Now, there are obviously cases where the hyper-realistic style can work. I think it works really well in Monster Hunter, for example. Monster Hunter aims to take these fantastical, weird creatures and bring them to biological life, to show them as if they were real, to show them as if they were existing within a grand ecosystem. And that works beautifully for Monster Hunter. Some of the Resident Evil remakes, including like Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 7 being excellent examples of this, look fantastic and more gritty and realistic because of the hyper-realistic style. Each game series that Capcom has is a unique project with its own stylistic niche, and DMC's stylistic niche is inherently a bit fantastical, whimsical, and gothic. The point of it is you have Dante going through these strange and wacky worlds, all of which are very high, pretentious, and important, and then he's going through it completely arrogant, realistic, and grounded, not really giving a fuck about anything that's going on. And that is a dichotomy that works beautifully. But you lose that when you enter this hyper-realistic style because everything looks stylistically the same. There's an edge taken off the gothic fun when everything is just covered in gritty slime textures. DMC is meant to be cartoonish and stupid. Let it look cartoonish and stupid, please, for the love of God. The approach taken to hyperrealism also renders these environments really uninteresting and drab to me. All of the areas of the city are cool in terms of what's supposed to be in them and what they're supposed to be, like the abandoned hotel, but they're just lacking this spice in terms of lighting and presentation that makes them feel like they stand out. In other games, hell is presented as this biological mass of twitching eyes and mounds of flesh as doors pulsate unnervingly. And in this game, I don't know, it's just like big bulges of blood. It's not very interesting looking. The game loses this biological edge and almost sense of body horror to the hell environments that it had in the previous games. And layering onto that problem, having all of these areas be self-contained misses out on the fun sense of coming back to an area you've previously been and seeing how it's changed, like how the passage of time affects areas in DMC1. This carries across into lighting and ambiance. Levels just always feel very dry and lacking in those elements. My point is, there's just no fun zest or spice to the visual presentation of this game, and the focus on hyperrealism lets down some really quite good designs. Generally, without going too far into detail, because of course there will be designs of Devil May Cry episodes shortly following this to go further into detail into that, character and enemy design is solid if you put aside the art direction. It builds on criticisms I had, like Nero's design not being different enough from Dante's design, and completely changes him, making him look visually more punk and edgy, which I really like. I love the short hair for Nero. Yeah, both Nero and Dante's designs are bangers. V's design I'm also a big fan of, fits in really nicely with like the ideas of the weakness of humanity that are presented within this game, and where humanity's real strength actually lies, being presented and manifested through his shadows. Not a big fan of Vergil's redesign though. I don't like the black and silver nearly as much as the blue and red. I think it loses out on a lot of key character storytelling that was present in DMC3's design. The enemies are all interesting and creative, with a lot of them taking inspiration from earlier designs in the series, like the Hell Kana obviously being inspired by the Hell Jailers from DMC3, Riots being inspired by Blades and Assault, and obviously the Death Scissors, yay, making another return. Boss designs across the board are also pretty damn solid. Cavalieri, Goliath, Malthus, Artemis, all really memorable, all really fun, interesting, and unique. The music is, as always, pretty damn strong across the board. Ignoring the big boys for a second, there's lots of really nice ambient tracks which add important impact or menace to the scenes that they're played within, that often go really underappreciated, as well as a lot of the boss themes like Urizen's that aren't talked about nearly enough because they are absolute bangers. But yeah, you want me to talk about the main character themes, so let's mention those. Devil Trigger is an absolute slammer. Bury the Light, I don't even need to go into. It suits Vergil so absolutely perfectly as a song. While being just like a musical banger in and of itself that's fun to listen to. And both of those songs, because they're such bangers, have become instantly iconic. Even people that have never heard of Devil May Cry have probably heard either Devil Trigger or definitely Bury the Light. They express the character arcs of the characters that they are linked to really nicely through the songs, I think. Crimson Cloud, V's theme, is a kind of fun battle theme. It suits him well enough, and it is a fun listen, but I can get why people aren't as much of a fan of it. And it is definitely the most unknown of the four main battle themes. I enjoy it, but it's not one that, like, I love to any major degree like Devil Trigger or Bury the Light. My main controversial opinion is that I actually really don't like Dante's theme, Subhuman. I just don't think the vibe fits him quite correctly. A lot of the music in Devil May Cry, I feel, is too angry for Dante. He's not nearly as much of a punk kid as he was in DMC3. So having the angriest and most outwardly screamy theme for him doesn't feel right. He's a much more relaxed, mellowed out, less angsty character than he was in DMC3, where having a really angry theme suited him very nicely. Also, Dante doesn't see himself as subhuman. The song just really doesn't fit him. It's so jarring whenever I play him. I actually switched to a different theme from one of the older games when playing him. I think I switched to Devils Never Cry, just because I think that suits him a lot better. He suits a song that's more stylish and operatic, rather than something that's angry and punky. I know it was done to fit in better with the rest of the songs in the soundtrack, but it really does not suit him, I think, down to its core. As for sound design, it's a very much mixed bag. Some enemies and weapon sounds sound absolutely amazing, and better than their original incarnations, and yet some of them just feel... Some enemies and weapons sound absolutely amazing, like the sound of the 10 count ticking up in Balrog, or the revving motor of the Cavalieri. But with things like Nero's Red Queen, for example, a lot of his sounds are a lot flatter and lack the punch and impact that they did in DMC4. I do wish in general there was a much... Just in general, I wish there was a bigger approach to the sound design of being a bit more cartoonish, outlandish, and wacky with. There is less emphasis on enemies having sound tells to their attacks. They're a lot less obvious and blend in with each other a lot more, which I think is a damn shame. It was really, really nice to have sound tells in the older DMC games. It gave you that extra level of skill of knowing those tells and how to respond to them. Now, DMC5 aims to be a grand culmination. For better or worse, this is the end of everything that DMC has been since its inception from 2001. And it is a literal end. This is the final game that Hideaki Itsuno will work on in the Devil May Cry series, resolving every major plot hook, everything that has been mounting and building over the course of the DMC series, with the minor exception of the promise that Dante's son was going to fight Mundus, but I'm not so sure that series writers actually care about resolving Mundus anymore. So it has quite a legacy to leave behind it, as what may possibly be the last Devil May Cry game, at least in the Vergil and Dante saga. And yeah, what an absolute banger to leave off on. And god, what a banger to leave off on. Putting some of my oncoming criticisms aside for one moment, this game is just so fucking cool. It has some of the best cutscenes in DMC, it has some of the most fun moments, the way it resolves the story is so fun, it's just good down to its core, right from the intro cutscene. It pays proper attention to most characters and their complex interactions with each other, and most importantly, stays true to the heart of what DMC is supposed to be as a series. Even if I have a few minor gripes with the execution, this is a worthy successor to DMC3. However, I do have quite a few issues, as I've already kind of outlined in my review. The split between different characters, while narratively satisfying, feels very empty in terms of gameplay, and it saps a lot of replay value and even enjoyment out of the base game for some players. It's similar to the problem I had with DMC4, except even worse, because now it's a lot more difficult to get established into playing one character when you're constantly split between three. DMC has had this really odd resistance to using the segmented mission design, along with DMC5's completely segmented feel in terms of missions not remotely linking to each other, to do something interesting with the mission design instead of what they came up with here. And here's my grand pitch. I think this game could be absolutely perfected, and by extension this extends to DMC4, if the multiple characters were split into multiple different campaigns. Imagine, you start playing the game as Nero with Mission 1. Nero Mission 1. You play through the game until you meet V in Mission 3. Meeting V unlocks V's campaign. You start playing through V's campaign parallel to Nero's campaign. You can choose to either play through missions as V, or play through missions as Nero. Nero and V are doing constantly separate things while progressing the plot ahead for each other. So you can either, as you're playing through, jump between characters and figure out what's going on in the background, or play through one character's campaign fully to the end and then jump back to other characters to see their perspective. This would work well with several things. Number one, the game already has this established timeline system of telling you when certain missions take place. Well, there you go. There's your natural order, so it doesn't get confusing when you're switching between different characters. If you want to organically jump and play the game in proper order, you can do so across multiple different playthroughs because you've got that timeline in place. And this would also completely get rid of the annoying gameplay dissonance. You wouldn't now be forced to switch to a different character you didn't like. If you don't like V, you don't have to play his campaign. You can let him sit to the sidelines and just enjoy the game as you have, completely having played Nero's missions. This would mean that individual campaigns were a bit shorter, maybe like 8 or 10 missions, but playtime as individual characters is already significantly shortened in this game. I think the maximum a single character gets in terms of missions is 9 for Nero, or possibly Dante, I'm not sure. And even if you didn't go with this mechanic, just doing something more interesting with the mission design would allow you to get more out of the narrative concept while improving some of the natural problems that come with this system and the gameplay. But then again, when my main major hanging criticism of your game is just, I don't think this one aspect of how you've structured your game lands quite perfectly, you know it's a pretty damn good game. Is it a good DMC to start with, though? I've seen a lot of people recommend this as like a starting point for beginners in the series, and while I do get that in terms of it just being a good game, it also being a new game, so visually there's a lot less jarring running back to PS2 graphics, even though I can't imagine why you wouldn't love to be back in PS2 graphics. And it is good in those senses, however, I've gotta say I don't think it's right. I think players should start with DMC3 as an ideal starting point for the series' gameplay in terms of complexity and in terms of where the story begins. Not having context for DMC5 just makes it really fucking weird and feel weightless and almost like a bad story, when in fact all the problem is that you just don't have the right supporting context. And hell, DMC3 is just an excellent game in its own right. Okay then, if it's not a good beginning point for players to jump on the series though, how is it as a finishing point? What's my grand assessment? It's pretty damn good, and it is a worthy endpoint to the series. I'm glad that at the last final hours, with the massive amounts of inconsistency DMC has had across its existence as a series, that they were able to pull out a final hat trick and whip out an absolute banger. But yeah, there's my thoughts on DMC5. A flawed but still very, very good final entry in a series I've spent 3 years of my life covering. So, where's the channel going to go from here? Well, I'm obviously going to finish up a Designs of Devil May Cry episode, and then there's going to be a couple more videos ranking, like, aspects of DMC, like missions, enemies, and bosses, so stick around if you're a Devil May Cry fan and you're interested in those. But past that point, I'm going to be playing a new series of games, which I'm hopefully, if enough people join the poll, going to allow you, the viewers, to decide what I play next. There'll be a poll linked in the description of the video. If you feel like it, please give it a click and vote on which series I should play next. I am very, very excited to get on and, play and yap about more games. But regardless, thank you as always for watching. Goodbye.